I'm a special collections archivist at the E.P. Taylor Research Library and Archive at the Art Gallery of Ontario, a position she has held since 2001. Her work at the AGO has involved the acquisition of archives of numerous Canadian artists. Amy received an MIST in Archival Studies from the Faculty of Information Studies at the University of Toronto in 2000 and holds degrees in art history from McMaster and Oxford universities. She completed her doctorate in Archival Studies at the University of Toronto in March of this year with the dissertation on the archives of Vera Frankel. Amy's paper is entitled Seeking the Archival Traces of Historical Women Artists.
So my paper today will examine the ways in which the analysis of contemporary artists' archives can begin to give us a sense of what's been lost when we try to make sense of the record of historical women artists. Trying to talk about an absence, of course, is kind of a problem. There's a certain amount of conjecture that's inevitable, but I'm encouraged by the title of this conference, Imagining History, to do just that. My starting point is my doctoral research on artists' archives, which explore the complex relationship between artistic practice, the artist's oeuvre, and the artist's archival fond. And to do so, I made an in-depth case study of a contemporary artist, Vera Frankel. It could be argued that contemporary art, in terms of its relationship to archives, is fundamentally different from art of previous eras, even from the art of the first half or so of the 20th century. But I want to question that argument a bit and see where it leads, or at least it seemed like a good idea when I was writing the abstract. So, when we consider the legacy of an individual artist, male or female, a central concept is that of the oeuvre, the body of surviving work by which that artist is known. This is problematic or not. But this concept of oeuvre is tightly bound up with artistic identity. What interests me in particular about this idea is its intimate relationship to the concept of the fond, which is a term that archivists insist on using, particularly in English Canada, for its unique denotation of the whole of the records that are created and kept by an individual or an organization. So in contrast to the more ubiquitous and more nebulous term archive, fond refers to something fairly concrete and fairly finite. These are the documents that a person actually used and kept. The archival traces of a person, of course, can be found elsewhere within bureaucratic systems or scattered throughout the records of friends and family, which can also be interesting, but it's not my subject here. In the case of a visual artist, the oeuvre and the fond typically have a common origin, which is the artist's studio, where finished works, artistic record-keeping, and other significant artifacts are usually bound up together in the site of artistic production. The anthropologist Alfred Gell gives an interesting account of the idea of the artist's oeuvre as a phenomenon with coherence and unity. Gell sees the distributed mind of the artist being made visible through his or her work, the oeuvre functioning as an index to the stopping points of the artist's agency. The cumulative traces of past artistic activity are thus a key ingredient in future production. And I'm just going to quote from this, but we need to indulge the use of the masculine pronoun in his writing. So, quote, thinking takes place outside us as well as inside us. The poet writes down his lines and then scratches them out, altering and improving his verses in ways that crucially depend on the existence of physical traces of his previous mental activity. And this is still truer of the graphic artist who continually uses his own past production as a spur to his future production, altering and modifying freely as he goes along. And in more general terms, the artist lives surrounded by his own works, completed or half completed, which live in his studio and provide him with an ever-present record of his activity over many years. So although Gell is writing mainly here about works of art, his comments are highly relevant to artistic record-keeping or archives. Indeed, the implication of his vision is that records and artworks alike have this indexing function in relation to the artist's agency. They are bound together into this ongoing cycle of artistic inspiration. So I've spoken elsewhere about my doctoral research on Vera Frankel's archives. And the goal of my research essentially was to use the case study of the artist to ask two principal questions. Firstly, what are the significant characteristics of the individual visual artist's personal records, record-keeping, and archives in the studio? And then secondly, what is the nature and the changes in the structure, content, and presentation of an artist's archives which are associated by their acquisition and related processes by an institution. So fundamentally, the research was an investigation of the significant characteristics of an artist's archives as they are shaped by her practice, and then as they are shaped by the efforts of the archival institution. So briefly, I carried out my research through a series of guided tour interviews, I call them, with the artist in her studio, in which we moved around the sites of record keeping, and I asked about records and documents as we encountered them. The artist also drew bird's eye view maps of the studio as a record keeping space, and she took photographs to supplement this verbal data. I then moved on to look at the portion of the artist's archives that has already been transferred to Queen's University Archives and interviewed the archivist who has worked closely with Frenkel to facilitate the acquisition and assist researchers who come to access the archives. So far from a being before and after scenario, the Francophone turned out to be a remarkably complex cultural phenomenon and the product of many authorial voices. A key area of literature for understanding my findings was that of life narrative, which essentially is a broadening of the scope of autobiographical studies. Sidonia Smith and Julia Watson used the term life narrative to encompass biographical acts of any sort, employing it, quote, as a general term for acts of self-presentation of all kinds, and in diverse media that take the producer's life as their subject, whether written, performative, visual, filmic, or digital, end quote. A key aspect of postmodern life narrative scholarship, unsurprisingly, is the nuanced view of self, which can be broken down into different facets. And these different aspects of the self exist in a complex, dynamic, and shifting interrelationship. So it's not a great stretch to consider the personal archival phone as a form of life narrative. The feminist literary scholar Marlene Kadar has written, like a conventional literary text, the archive too is a complex site of influences and representations. But it is also an incomplete site created by this donor or that, by this survivor, or by that librarian, by which of course she means archivist. In other words, part of what makes the archive a complex text is that it is a fragmentary piece of knowledge or an unfixed and changing piece of knowledge. Scholars in archival studies have recently started to co-opt the literature of life narrative, finding in it a way to make sense of the personal archival phone as a very particular kind of autobiographical statement. Another important set of ideas came from the small but growing literature surrounding artists' studios. And perhaps to a degree greater than any other profession, visual artists are traditionally associated with a studio as the site of artistic creation. As prevailing styles in art in recent decades have gradually become less centered on the creation of physical work, the studio has evolved from a strictly physical location to a conceptual apparatus for artistic creation, although this paradoxically, I think, brings together studios of the past with studios of the present in a certain way. So the contemporary artist studio is a complex entity and not necessarily even a single physical place. This complexity apparently only serves to reinforce the close ties between the studio and the identity of the artist. In the words of the artist collective Art and Language, quote, the studio has of course always been as much an ideological construct as a physical location, the image or description of the studio always an active reflection of the artist's self-image, whether substantial or mythical. So whether physical or metaphorical, the studio is the common origin for the opera and the phone, and it's a place that uniquely reflects the identity of the artist. So for the present purposes, I want to focus my attention on my answers to the first of my two research questions and describe some of my findings. So what are the significant characteristics of an individual visual artist's personal records, record keeping, and archives in the studio? First, I would say that record keeping is absolutely integral to the artistic process. In the case of Vera Frenkel, the most significant characteristic of her record keeping and her archives is that they're essential to her practice. They're this constant element in her life which provides continuity among the several studios the artist has maintained over her career. Indeed, if the studio is conceived of as an activity or a portable practice, Frenkel's record keeping can be understood as the enduring embodiment of that studio. The artist's records offer her the possibility of creative recycling, which is essential to the character of her work, and the possibility of motifs and characters recurring, the multi-layered blending of voices and media, and perhaps even the artist's engagement with themes of memory and evidence, all depend on her continued access to the traces of past artistic activity in her studio. Second, that records, that is archives, and non-records are bound up together in the studio. So archives are difficult to separate entirely from elements in the studio that will not be considered records or archives by the institution. These include items of furniture, strangely, that are closely related to aspects of record keeping. I'm going to go back a second so you can see some of the furniture here. The artist's personal library fulfills a role in her practice that is related to that of her records, in that it serves partly to represent her projects, her ideas, and her relationships, and it can be browsed for inspiration in a way that's similar to the re-encountering of archives or records in the studio space. Finished works of art in prominent visible storage in the studio serve partly as a record of past accomplishment, and potentially they're available for browsing and creative re-encountering in the same way as records and books. In the studio space, furniture, books, and artwork enter into Frenkel's account of her record keeping because their physical integration into the studio and their practical integration into the artist's ongoing studio practice. The living aspects of these items, of course, is impossible to translate into any institution. Their physical disposition can be documented to some extent through photography and mapping, as it is here and during our guided tour. Third, and I've painted this already, that records and archives are a very complex mode of self-representation. So as Alfred Jell articulates in Art and Agency, thinking can take place outside a person through the involvement of the traces of past activity. Frenkel's records are her externalized thoughts, a self-representation that is unlike any other. They have an extremely intimate relationship to the artist in the sense that they have this sort of metonymic aspect, serving as a kind of externalized self, by virtue of their function as externalized thought or memory. There's also, of course, involuntary, accidental, and collaborative aspects of archives which complicate their nature as self-representations. There's many voices in the archives captured in different moments and by different media, like the indefinite interdisciplinary voices at play in one of Frenkel's artworks. In a sense, the authenticity of Frenkel's records as a representation of self depends on a combination of these factors: their utility as externalized thought and the interplay of multiple layers of time and different voices. But significantly, another finding is that records archives do not speak for themselves. So in the personal sphere here in the studio, these records exist for the artist's own use. And I found when I attempted to apprehend the studio independently of a guided tour, her records are mute. They're mute, so to speak, without the oral scaffolding of her guiding narrative, which is a term I'm borrowing from Martha Langford's analysis of photograph albums. Artistic inspiration as a process or a moment is difficult or probably impossible for outside eyes to perceive. And of course, the oral scaffolding, as I experienced it, was in some sense a performance by Frenkel for me, the narrative of her records being another mode of life narrative. So as a visiting researcher and archivist in the studio, I played the role of a coaxer of this narrative. I was interested in an extremely quotidian behavior of the artist, in one she wouldn't normally be used to speaking about, and interested in its physical manifestations, neither of which Frenkel would have had any prior occasion to say much about. But at the same time, she would have been becoming aware of the potential wider interest in her archives through the process of transferring these archives to Queen's University. But really, the archives in the studio can only be known through Frenkel, either through controlled access or through her telling. As Smith and Watson describe, there's a revelation of self and a concealment of self in any life narrative, and this aspect is perceptible both in Frenkel's archives and in the guided tour of them. The controlling self of the artist rules her self-representation, and the true Vera Frenkel, of course, is ultimately unknowable, visible in glimpses through her choice of anecdote and commentary, but impossible to pin down. As the artist herself wrote with reference to the accumulations in her studio in 1979, quote, "The truth is always in the interstices between things. A piece of evidence is always a manifest ambiguity. What is stated masks what isn't." End quote. And I realize actually what's missing from this, because I've concentrated on the archives of the studio, is the factor of the cultural context in which archives are created. So is it, sorry, volume or?
Yeah.
Can you hear? Okay. That is, there will be cultural precedents of peers, of literature, of all sorts of things that will inform the way in which an artist constructs her archives for posterity, if indeed she does. So what my research findings provide overall is a perspective on the intricacy and the richness of one particular artist's archives in her studio. These archives are inseparable from the artist's practice, and in some sense they are her practice. The specific place where the archives are deployed, the studio emerges as an essential element in that practice, and the archives emerge as an incredibly complex and nuanced form of life narrative, of self-representation. I would confidently argue that Vera Frankel cannot be fully understood as an artist without substantial reference to her archives. And at the same time, one could argue that Frankel and her archives are a unique case. And I haven't even talked here about the ways in which archives are already a profound theme in her work, which is certainly an interesting factor in that case. More broadly, one could argue that the role of archives in Frankel's practice is a circumstance that could only occur in the case of a contemporary artist. And I certainly see validity in both of these arguments. But after more than a decade of working with artists' archives at the AGO, I think there's a little bit more to be said. So when we survey the landscape of the archives of historical women artists in Canada, and I don't need to tell you guys this, the picture is somewhat bleak. I made a brief and informal survey for the purposes of this paper, using names from the CWAHI Artist Database and from the Art Gallery of Ontario Collections Database. And in brief, of course, for women artists who died prior to the mid-20th century, there usually isn't much of an archival record in the sense of what we could call a fond, rather than scattered traces that an individual leaves in vital statistics records or the registers of associations. Where documents survive, they tend to be part of a family archive. In the early period, the artist's family members were important enough for other reasons to keep their papers together. So, for example, Suzanne Moody's archives have this characteristic to some extent. She has a relatively substantial body of papers at Library and Archives Canada, but it also relates more to her literary career than her artistic efforts. And I think Emily Carr's archives at the British Columbia Archives, although they're extensive, also have this quality of being more about her literary estate and matching. They look more like an author's papers than an artist. Of course, I have to acknowledge here that it's probable that part of the problem is artists' archives in general, that regardless of the gender of the artist, there's less of a history of collecting artists' archives than literary ones. So it was not obvious to either individuals or institutions that an artist's records should be kept in the first place or preserved for posterity. Prior to the mid-20th century, the archives of male artists in Canada are generally not extensive either. Institutions were not collecting this kind of material, and there would be no precedent for the artist to keep an extensive body of documentation. But it might be instructive to compare the surviving archives of George Agnew Reid and those of his wives, Mary Easter and Mary Wrench. George Reid compiled his archives into two massive scrapbooks during the latter years of his life, and you see the larger one of the two. So as archives go, they're relatively compact, but they're still impressive. This is some 700 pages containing everything from his salon exhibitor's card of 1896 to early oil sketches to blueprints for the numerous houses that he designed and built. In comparison, his second wife, Mary Wrench Reid, left behind only a slender 28-page scrapbook. And Mary Easter Reid left nothing one could call an archival phone at all. At the AGO, we have her biographical questionnaire. Of course, this is not what I call a phone, but sent in response to a general mailing in 1913. She represents herself. And then one photograph of the artist in her studio in her later years, which I realize will be familiar to everybody. The Resource Center here. So it seems that George Reid had a certain expectation that he would matter to posterity, despite the nearly non-existent market for his work at the time of his death. He compiled this huge record of his life, and neither of the Mary Reids seem to have had the same. One thing that Vera Frankel certainly has going for her is a confidence which is evident from the early stages of her career that her work might matter to posterity. It takes a certain robustness of ego and a certain security to keep archives in the first place and to transfer them to a public repository, which Frankel started doing to McGill University Library in 1990. One definitely needs a room of one's own, a studio to be specific. And it's still not something to take for granted. I think of the case of a prominent contemporary Canadian woman artist whose career blossomed in the 1970s, just slightly later than Frankel's, and by the time the AGO approached her about her archives, she'd thrown out her early correspondence and her performance documentation because, as she said, she couldn't imagine anyone would care about that stuff. The exception that might make things a bit more interesting is Kathleen Munn, which we love to talk about at the AGO. This Munn's cows. I've spoken elsewhere about Munn and the extraordinary survival of her archival legacy, sort of against chance. It was passed down to her niece and then to her niece's niece, and somehow survives now at the AGO through a series of happy accidents. So her reputation, which as you probably all know, was revived by Joyce Siemens in her 1988 exhibition and catalogue, and more recently in an exhibition by Georgiana O'Leary at the AGO. So far from being basic biographical documents, Munn's archives actually do reveal the artist's working process. The archives illuminate the work. Here's a page from one of her notebooks and one of her many, many little pencil sketches. And they reveal the amount of reading, analysis, and obsessive experimentation that went into the creation of her paintings and drawings, in particular the Great Passion series. This is actually in the archives. This is a series of very small sketches that she has glued together to make a larger image. I would go so far as to argue that without Munn's archives, we wouldn't have as clear an understanding of what her work is about. Munn's archives give us a glimpse of the artist's studio and the artist at work, although actually, ironically, the one surviving image of the artist's studio is a complete tabula rasa. It's very composed. There's nothing but a Matisse print on the wall to give you any clue, but I think it's an image that was somewhat constructed. In this sense, Munn's archives have something in common with Frenkel's, so even though clearly Munn is a modernist and the problems that her records helped her to work through are formal and spatial, I see this common aspect. So on its own, of course, it's not very constructive to observe that we lack many traces of historical women artists. And first of all, when I talk about what we have failed to collect, I don't at all mean to negate the efforts of archivists in the past. I'm thinking in particular now of the institution now known as Library and Archives Canada, which in an earlier era did a great deal to build the archives of Canadian women artists. In particular, the work of Anne Goddard, who was an outstanding manuscript archivist and was acquiring the archives of women artists when few other institutions were. My purpose here, I guess, is to illuminate the place of archives, the records of process, the artist's self-representation in documentary form, and their place in the way that we understand artists and their work. Arguably, the boundaries of an artist's oeuvre, of finished work, have always depended on a very complex interplay of factors such as intentionality, the art market, taste, institutional mandates, and above all, politics of every kind. And when we forget or look uncritically at the historical traces that surround this oeuvre, we're only getting part of the picture, and I think we need to remember that.